Melina here, and ready to talk about everyone's favorite reimagining, life and death. As someone who started YouTube being predominantly an anti-Twilight vlog, I knew it was going to be my duty, my responsibility to talk about Twilight in some capacity for the 10th anniversary. But thankfully, Stephenie Meyer knew how to give me material to talk about. Stephenie Meyer decided that she was going to write a gender swap version of Twilight called Life and Death. And the reason for this reimagining is probably the most hilarious thing ever. She wrote this reimagining to prove to feminists and feminist critics who said that Bella was a terrible female lead and brought back women 10 years or however many years they chose at the time because of how weak and pathetic she was with her relationship with Edward and how she was treating the narrative. Stephenie Meyer's response to this criticism has always been that Bella is weak because she's a human amongst monsters, not because she's a woman, and that girls aren't the only ones who are obsessive in relationships, guys are too. So she wrote this reimagining with the fantastic characters of Beau, or Beaufort, Swan, and Edith Cullen, spelled Edythe, as a way to prove to us that it is not Bella, it is Twilight that is backwards and gendered. So when I read this book, I was reading to see, is Stephenie Meyer right? Is the problem gender, or is this just a narrative that would create a weak main character? The gender problems are still there. There were a lot of changes that were made from Bella to Beau that prove that while the main character of Twilight would always be a pathetic, whiny, annoying douchebag of either gender, that Stephenie Meyer views characters in a gendered way, which informs how these characters react. I could go on a very, very long tirade about this, but I decided to slim it down to four. 4 reasons why Life and Death proves that it is gender normative, reductive, and that at the end of the day, Bella is always going to be a problem because she was written to encompass all of these very gendered ideologies, and removing her and making it a man only proves that fact tenfold over. So here we go. The 4 biggest gender fails in Life and Death. Number 1. Beau doesn't have a chip on his shoulder the way Bella does. This is something that she explains within the very first introduction of the book. She does this kind of pseudo-mathematical breakdown of the changes that happened from Beau to Bella, and she explains some of the changes that happened in this following statement. 5% of the changes were because Beau's personality developed just slightly differently than Bella's. The biggest variations are that he's more OCD, he's not nearly so flowery with his words and thoughts, and he's not as angry. He's totally missing the chip Bella carries around her shoulder all the time. So you mean he's not a bitch the way that Bella was? A lot of these descriptions are very gendered. The fact that he's not as flowery with his language, the fact that he's not as angry, miserable, catty, you know what, these are all code words for being too bitchy. And this was the first sign that this was going to be kind of some fuckery. As for the statement that Beau is somehow OCD, there is no evidence of this at all, and I don't really understand why that term was even used in this book. Like, there's nothing OCD about Beau. I don't know, and I think one of the fun changes about this, is in Twilight, Bella is a big Jane Austen fan. Well, because we're dealing with Beaufort, and Beaufort cannot be into Jane Austen because Jane Austen's only for the ladies. Instead, he's into Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Why this choice? Who knows, but it's manly. Gender fail number 2. Rape is turned into drugs. In Twilight, Bella is almost gang raped by a group of guys when she goes into, I think it's Port Angeles or something like that, because that's what happens to Ingenue, and has to be rescued by Edward in the middle of it. Also, one of the background stories for my personal favorite character in the series, Rosaline Hale, is that she was raped and then left for dead by her fiance. Both of these are removed in the gender swap. Beaufort, in comparison, accidentally stumbles upon a drug deal or some very weird drug turfy, very, white bread version of what a drug deal looks like. And they decided because he's walked in on them, they're gonna shoot him, because that's the best way to not bring attention to yourself in the middle of Port Angeles, is to shoot a white kid in the middle of the street. Now, what's hilarious about this is that this is actually a continuity thing, because in the beginning of the novel, when Beaufort first rides in to Washington and through Seattle, I believe, he knocks his bag into a gentleman who ends up being the drug dealer guy in the scene. So we have a whole continuity storyline based around Beaufort's clumsiness and to make this drug deal scenario work. In addition, the male version of Rosalie, very poorly named Royal, every single fucking one of these name changes is terrible. Royal, instead of being raped, is instead beaten by his fiance's boyfriend, and that's how he is left for dead. It kind of has two gender fails in one. One, it shows that these were all rape for dramas that had no real consequence and were only put in there for shock value and as being super cliche ways of having empathetic female characters, especially ones who are unlikable, or they're supposed to be unlikable in the case of Rosalie. Two, it only enforces an idea that men cannot be raped, which is why instead of having that trauma happen to them, instead they get beaten up or get risk of being shot. These are clearly gendered reasons for these changes, because if you believe that it can happen to both men and women, why would you remove it? Number three, and I think one of the most upsetting ones for me, is that Beau is turned into a vampire. This was a very, very, very big deal for me, because a lot of the issues that make Bella a bad female protagonist happen over the course of the series of Twilight. They're not insular to just Twilight itself. Bella being catonic and going and seeking out all these kind of adventures so she can see Edward's face in New Moon. You have her being just the object of this love triangle in Eclipse. You have her giving up a lot of her dreams of going to school and things like that to get married, to become a vampire. You have everything going on with Renesmee that takes away any of her agency about her body. I would say the only good thing about this reimagining is that Renesmee does not fucking exist, and that is amazing news. In this version, when the female version of James, Joss, decides to go after Beaufort, when Joss bites Beaufort, the Cullens are too late. Instead of trying to suck the blood out like they do in Twilight, Beaufort is transformed into a vampire. This immediately empowers Beau. He will no longer be the human in distress for 3.5 books. He will no longer have to deal with the fear of Edith leaving him for any weird reason. He will not have any sexual agency be denied to him, or any of that. That is all gone. That has all been fixed. I just killed the bug, sorry. Where Bella was constantly disempowered, Beaufort has been empowered within the first book. Now, a person can argue, and I understand this argument, is that Stephenie Meyer only wrote this gender-bent narration for Twilight only. She's not going to go do New Moon, Eclipse, etc. and so forth. So she has to wrap up all those plot elements in this one book. My argument is, no, she does not. And if she did, she doesn't have to do this by giving Beaufort something that Bella begged for 4 books. But you can read Twilight by itself. You don't have to read all of the books to really understand anything. You can read Twilight by itself and you're good. So you could do Life and Death and have it in the same way that Twilight did, and it would be the same. Number 4 is the fact that Edith is less abusive than Edward. And this is a subtle thing that you have to, I would say, to really understand what I mean by this, you have to have read the two side by side. But I would read scenes that I knew were problematic in Twilight, and then read the scenes that in Life and Death, and compare how they were written. And I would say the big difference between the two that she sort of would need to read both to really encapsulate is that Edith is more vulnerable, more open, more exposed in her emotions than Edward is or ever was, in my opinion. And I think in the reveal scene when they're talking, there's this fear in her of Beaufort leaving that's very sort of like, you know, I even though I know this is not the motion she's making, in my head I would see her like doing this, like this very like nervous sort of like, do they like me? Do they like me? Much more than I ever got from Edward. And it was something that I thought was very noticeable as you kept reading, as you understood Edith more, that there is a confidence to her, but there's also this very, very scared part of her of feeling very emotionally vulnerable that I get more from her than I got from Edward. The most apparent scene is in the one after the car chase, which I will read to you because I think that's the easiest way to kind of get what I'm talking about. This is the car scene in Life and Death. Get in, a furious voice hissed. I dove into the Volvo's dark interior, not even questioning how she'd come to be here. Relief and a new panic swamping me at the same time. What if she got hurt? I yanked the door shut behind me while I shouted, "Drive, Edith! Get out of here! He's got a gun." But the car did not move. "Keep your head down," she ordered, and I heard the driver's side door open. I reached out blindly towards the sound of her voice, and my hand caught her slim, cold arm. She froze when I touched her. There was no give, though my fingers wrapped tightly around the leather of her jacket. "What are you doing?" I demanded. "Drive." My eyes were adjusting, and I could just make out her eyes in the reflected glow of the headlights. First they looked at my hand, gripping her arm. Then they narrowed and glared out the windshield, towards where the man and the woman must be watching, evaluating. They could shoot at any second. "Give me just a minute here, Beau." I could hear her teeth were clenched together. I knew she would have no problem breaking free of my grasp, but she seemed to be waiting for me to let her go. That wasn't going to happen. "If you go out there, I'm going with you," I said quietly. "I'm not letting you get shot." Her eyes glared forward for another second, and then the door slammed shut, and we were reversing at what felt like about 60. "Fine," she huffed. The car spun in a tight arc as we raced backwards around the corner, and then suddenly we were speeding forward. "Put on your seatbelt," she told me. So that is Life and Death. Here is Twilight. "Get in," a furious voice commanded. It was amazing how instantaneously the choking fear vanished. Amazing how suddenly the feeling of security washed over me, even before I was off the street, as soon as I heard his voice. I jumped into the seat, slamming the door shut behind me. It was dark in the car. No light had even come on with the opening of the door, and I could barely see his face in the glow from the dashboard. The tires squealed as he spun around to face north, accelerating too quickly, swerving towards the stunned men in the street. I caught a glimpse of them diving for the sidewalk as we straightened out and left toward the harbor. "Put on your seatbelt," he commanded, and I realized I was clutching the seat with both hands. I quickly obeyed. The snap as the belt connected was loud in the darkness. He took a sharp left, racing forward, blowing through several stop signs without a pause. I mean, the fact that Beaufort can talk to Edith. Beaufort gets to assert himself in ways that Bella never gets the opportunity to do so. There's a scene where, like, Bella is talking to the female version of Jacob, Judith, and in Twilight, Bella's kind of being all seductive and flirty with Jacob, whereas in Life and Death, Beaufort and Judith are just having a fucking conversation. It's not any flirty, seductive bullshit. There's differences between the way the female characters are treated in comparison to the male companions, like with Michaela, who's the female version of Mike, being much more sympathetic. All these little micro changes to gender that equal up into one bigger examination of how Twilight, at the very core of itself, is just a traditional gender story that has no evolution. And I think the most disturbing thing about Life After Death is that The changes that Stephenie Meyer chose to make are overall inconsequential. She didn't make her book more diverse. She didn't add any gay characters. She didn't make the Native American characters any less stereotypical. It's still a bunch of white, straight people doing white, straight people things. Though there are more women in positions of power, that's only because in the original books they were men. So that just even shows that even that little positive thing is because she made all of these societies so patriarchal. There are many writers that have come back to their series and been like, I should have wrote it better, I should have been more diverse, I should have done this. Like, Rick Riordan did this. Ursula K. Le Guin does this. Like, there were so many other writers. You know, I think even J.K. Rowling has done a much better job at writing queer and people of color in her other series than she has in Harry Potter. You can evolve. You can grow, but that means accepting the criticism that people have placed on you and deciding that I'm not going to hide from it, I'm going to embrace it and do better. And I just don't think that Stephenie Meyer wants to do better, and that's what makes everything so disappointing, is that she could do so much more than she does, but she doesn't because she doesn't have to, because she has found her niche, she has found her audience, they will buy this stuff and they will eat it all up, and she does not need to improve. She does not have to get better as a writer or as a creator or as a thinker because she has an audience that will buy her work, and that's all she really needs. If you want to read it because you're a fan of Twilight, I don't even know if you would enjoy it as much as Twilight, but it exists. God help us all. At least it's not the Host 2. Can we just never have the Host 2? Because the Host was terrible. Terra-fucking-bull. Emphasis on the bull.